Simon, never would have treated his own daddy that way, lest the back of his head land somewhere upside his head. Nor would his father have treated his father like that. The 48 men were of the no-nonsense breed. Simon's daddy had built the house with his 2 rock-hard hands 78 years ago and would have thought nothing of using one of them to take down a 2-grown son with a runaway mouth. World-famous trumpet player or not, Julian ought to show more respect. No, Julian ain't called. Simon put his hands in his pocket and looks up at the ruffled sky. Not since yesterday. Sylvia starts the engine. Well, you know the boy had a point. Simon doesn't know whether she's talking about Julian's anger at him for not leaving before the storm or for that business with Matthew Parmenter, the latest item on the list of painful issues that divided father and son like prickly thorns, and which was already really none of Julian's business anyway. Either way, he's heard enough. I gotta check on my beans, Simon said. Did you get your blood pressure prescription filled? Simon laughed. Woman, leave me be. If I die, just carry me on up to the Silver Creek. Dump me under that magnolia tree next to Ladina. Right. Sylvia rolls her eyes. You and Silver Creek. Why don't you just go on back there where you need to live? Then you can be her problem for the rest of eternity. Been thinking about it. Simon strokes his chin, narrows his eyes into a sly squint. But then who'll be up here to meddle with you? She laughs a little, furrows her perfectly arched brows. Stay well, Simon. Be careful. I worry about you, silly man. Simon smiles through his twinkling eyes. Don't. I'ma be fine. Take care, sweet lady, he says after her in a voice she couldn't possibly hear. Okay. I'm going to skip a little further because it's moving a little slower. Okay. The main event was on. In minutes, the wind bellowed, rising now and then into a thin, shrill sob like a disgust fast. Simon's father had built the house well, but it would still be a long night. Simon stacked his dishes in the sink, opened the pantry door, and fumbled through a pile of old clothes, boots, checker sets, and domino boxes until he found the box as big as a hamper. He pulled it out and dragged it in the middle of the floor. The hurricane box. Ladina had always been one to prepare for the worst. After her passing, he still dragged it out year after year out of loyalty or reflex, and now he pulled the items out one by one: an oil lamp, a flashlight, a first aid kit, a box of wooden matches, and an unopened box of tapers, a hand crank radio, and 3 bags of dried soup he picked up in an army surplus store in Baton Rouge. He put the dried soups back in, but set the oil lamp and the radio, still bearing his price tag, on the floor next to the box. And from a deep corner, he pulled the Bible Jacob Fortier had given him on his 16th birthday, a week before he died. Simon ran his fingers along the brittle edge of the dry leather. He pulled out his chair from the dining room table, sat, and opened the Bible. He turned to the first page, the name page, and at the end of the list of the 48th verse, he traced his hand over his father's Wrigley script. Simon Fortier, born July 8, 1929. And then his fingers traced the words written in his own hand. Julian Fortier, born August 13, 1969. Seeing his father's hand always brought mist to his eyes, but tonight it was the sight of Julian's name that moved him. A frail and sickly newborn delivered with a tiny hole in his heart. The boy had been given less than ever time for survival. On Julian's birth night, during the surgery, Simon found himself sitting in the cold fluorescent glare of his father's waiting room, head bowed between his hands, bargaining with the Lord. When the child was finally given a good bill of health, Simon found a payphone and called his closest relations, his Auntie Marie and cousin Genevieve at Silver Creek. How is he? Genevieve's voice was cautious. Simon had pushed the words out through a cloud of tears. Scrawny, no color. Doc says he'll be okay, though. Probably good as new. Lord Jesus, Genevieve cried and called to her mother. I'ma send you some of my herbs to him, Auntie Marie had told him in her usual too loud telephone voice. Okay, we're going to skip on a little bit. Okay, Simon went to the window, and peered out, the sky black now, the wind spanking the trees in rhythmic frenzy, the pounding rain all but horizontal. The wind bellowed and cawed like something with bared teeth and scratching claws. His pulse quickened. Simon went to the kitchen to pour himself a drink. The bourbon left over from last year's July 4th block party left to calm his racing mind. He found it on the top shelf of the refrigerator in a half-filled Pilsner glass, then sat in his recliner and leaned back to listen to the banshee screams of the worst winds he'd ever heard. His house pounded with the steady drumbeat of thunder and wind and sudden fear. Something unnerved him, and he wished for all the world that he had talked to Julian tonight. There was always a comfort, a reassurance in hearing his son's voice, no matter how far away he was, no matter what they were going through. He turned up the whole glass, then leaned back in his recliner and frowned as the slow burn of the liquor took hold in his gut. He closed his eyes and let the drink numb his muddled thoughts. For the day, grayness and spitting rain consumed the sky. That night, he slept soundly, and when he woke the next morning, it was to the sound of water crashing through his door and quickly gathering around his bed. Chapter 2, Tokyo, August 2005. He should have been having the time of his life. He'd missed the scene for so long, the cavern dark room pierced by the spotlight's amber glow, the rhythmic session kicking a tight groove, the people digging his music and ready to unleash their adulation. It could have been any stage, almost anywhere, and this was the scene that got his juices going. So the moment he stepped onto the Blue Note Tokyo stage 25 minutes ago, it had felt like coming home. But now, the pain burrowed so deep it made him dizzy. The sound was still coming out of his trumpet, but it was as if he was standing outside of himself, watching his own fingers move, almost admiring their ability to go on while everything else in him wanted to seize up or shut down. With the lightning-quick tempo the drummer had set, he struggled to keep up as the wall of sound, piano, bass, drums, tenor, roared like a train on a downhill track full speed ahead, with him or without him. Another pain buzzed through his jaw, and his embouchure froze. He stopped playing and shook his head while the piano covered him, took up the slack. The room grew hot, airless, as sweat beaded above his lip and his neck tightened. While the pain burned on, the spotlights glared like headlights. Suddenly, he felt like some four-legged creature who staggered onto a highway in front of a truck, blinded by the lights and frozen with fear. He couldn't do it, couldn't go on. So even though they hadn't reached the bridge of the tune, he leaned over to the pianist. He whispered hoarsely in his ear, "Slow, anything slow, then we quit." He barely got through the ballad, even though he'd written it himself, and he was the first one off the stage, ducking into the small backstage room reserved for the band. Sitting on the sofa, chest pumping hard as he crossed his legs against the cool black leather, Julian Fortier filled his winded lungs with air and exhaled a ragged sigh, then uncrossed his legs, leaned back, and stared up at the pale gray walls. One by one, the others in the quartet came in, each more deliberately quiet than the next. The pianist gave him a flickering, questioning look, then turned away, and having nothing better to do, pulled out his cell phone and tapped on the keyboard. The bass player coughed nervously as he zipped the canvas cover around the rented instrument. The tenor player and drummer, not knowing what else to do after putting horn and drumsticks away, looked at each other, then headed to the table laden with bottles of Perrier and food that the management of the club had graciously supplied. No one spoke. The tension in the room was as thick as the fog had been in that early morning across Tokyo Bay before settling over the downtown of the city. All the men averted their eyes from each other, waiting for their band leader to explain. But for the moment, the trumpeter sat smoothing the crease of his pinstripe gray pant leg, his horn beside him, trying to make sense of what went down in front of all those people, imagining the reviews in the Tokyo press, celebrated jazz trumpeter bombs and premature comeback, something like that, or worse. He grabbed his trumpet off the cushion next to him and rapidly fingered the valves. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. He'd been okay at the rehearsals. He should have breezed through the set like a pro he was. His jaw sufficiently healed after the accident, his tone rolling sweetly and effortlessly out of his horn, notes flying unconsciously and his mind zooming in a zone where he could do no wrong. Applause should have thundered from the table, since the Japanese, among the most appreciative of his fans, were the first to hear him after an 11-month absence from studio and stage. He should have been the hero of the night. Instead, the applause had been weak. Polite, yet confused. He felt like tucking his tail and running, and that's exactly what he had done. He had to tell the guys the worst possible news. The gig was over. On top of that, they'd have to take a whopping cut and pay for an incomplete date and hope the club would let him reschedule when he fully recovered, if he ever did. The hottest jazz club in Japan would have to go dark for the rest of the week while he hunted down the next orthopedist. Hey man, don't sweat this. You'll be back. Antoine, the short and athletically stocky pianist and a hell of a player to just 25 and a loyal friend, stood over him, his large eyes calm, a sushi roll in one hand, the other extended out to him. The trumpeter grabbed it and clasped it, then put his hand back on his jaw. Feels like it's on fire. That sucks, man. Julian rolled his eyes, leaned against the sofa, stretching out his long legs. Then he raised himself forward and got up. Guess I better talk to everybody and tell them what's going on. Everybody, listen up. I've got something too, but as he spoke, Jeffrey, the drummer, held up a quieting finger, his head angled up like the other men, their eyes locked on a flat panel TV screen placed high on the wall in a corner near the door. Across the bottom of the screen broadcasting CNN Live, the crawl read, "Levees breached, 80% of New Orleans underwater." Julian felt a gasp leave his body and something flipped over in his stomach. The band of heat around his neck tightened even more and crept up to the pain spot on his jaw. He and the men, each one of them except him, born in the neighborhoods where they now lived in Brooklyn, watched in silence as footage of the flood flashed across the screen and captions told the story of the drowning city. Helicopters like giant steel dragonflies hovered over what looked more like rivers than streets, and boats and makeshift rafts cruised through the neighborhoods he recognized as well as his own reflection. And the camera panned back to the wide shot. All the men, as if on cue, each let out a rush of breath or shook their heads. Most of the city, even its freeways, appeared submerged in inky, shiny blackness. The pumping heat felt in his chest as he left the stage now returned. Nothing else mattered now. Not the horrible set he just played, the guys in the band, Matsumoto, the disappointed audience, or his aching jaw. All that mattered was what was happening to the place he was born in, the place where his father lived.